Welcome to another Airbrush Asylum video. In this tutorial video I'm going to show you how I airbrushed some skulls within smoke flames on a Harley front fender. So let's get into it. I am mapping out my skulls and fire using some freehand templates. Template you see here is AirShot stencil template, skull background 2, and I'm also using my fire tool template set to rough in my fire. Now I'm using white Trident airbrush paint. This is already pre-reduced, and you can see I'm just using that to sketch in my design. So you notice I'm using different parts of the template to create my fire. So using the sharp edge as well as freehand airbrushing and just creating that flow as I'm airbrushing it on there. So you'll notice I've switched to a different freehand skull template for those smaller skulls. The one I just showed you there was skull background 1. And just continuing on with that white, so just mapping in the whole design, and then I'm going to continue and start to detail the skulls. Okay, so you'll notice now I'm up nice and close with my airbrush, and I'm starting to work on the eye sockets. So I've got to build a white base, and then I'll come back in and shade back later on. So you'll notice I've got a bit of that flamelet coming out of the eye socket, so I'll start to put little bits and pieces in like that so that I know how I want it to all look and where I want that fire to be coming out of certain areas of the skull. You don't want to overdo it, so just little hints of that works really well. The airbrush that I'm using at the moment is the GSI Krios PS770. This runs a 0.18mm needle nozzle setup, so you can get nice fine detail as well as broad spray, or reasonably broad spray. It's not going to give you the same sort of broad spray as something like the Eclipse, but at least it's going to be versatile enough. But essentially it is a detail brush. You'll notice that I've added a little bit of texture. The templates that I used there were the Blair Micro Dot templates. And I'll have some links to products that I use within this video in the description below, so be sure to check that out. So working on the teeth, same thing. You can see I'm building the shapes at the moment and just building all of the detail in, but it's not overly detailed at this stage. I'll come back in and refine it later with a transparent black. At the moment now I am adding some sort of texture in there as well. Essentially this is a lot looser than what it will become. It'll really sharpen up as I get to the final tones. So bringing in a few more of those flame licks, just highlighting some of those edges, just to get that sort of wispy and smokiness out of them. I didn't want them to be too stark. I'm switching to another template here. This is the Dispersion Snap template by Blair School of Realism. You can see some of those edges are like real jagged edges, which gives a nice sort of feel for around the skull. I don't want it to be too smooth, so I'm using that to get that edge to be a bit rougher. Also using the dots there to create some more texture on the skulls, so continually moving the template around to get some different effects. They're starting to sketch out the other skull now. Same procedure, using that white. Brightening up some of those teeth. You can really notice now how, blurry that's looking at the moment. So I don't put a great deal of time into the first layer. I just sort of sketch in, get like a rough sketch happening, and then build it from there. integrating some of that fire in there. So you can see I'm starting to get a bit more of a 3D appearance now. Bit of texturing again, adding those dots, and then moving on to the next skull. So if this is the first time watching one of our videos, then welcome. For all of our regular viewers, welcome back. I do hope that you're enjoying this video so far. Be sure to check out loads of other tutorials and videos on our channel. And if you are enjoying this video, by all means give it the thumbs up, share it out. Let's build this airbrushing community together. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing, tap on that bell icon, and that'll notify you every time I put out new content. So a few final highlights and flame licks, and we're almost ready to begin detailing these skulls with some transparent black. Okay, so switching to transparent black. This is transparent base mixed with black, so I add drops of black to the transparent base, and I also mix it with reducer. And I want it reasonably dark, but by having that transparent base in there allows for the texturing and some of the detail to shine through, whereas if I just used a straight opaque black, then it's going to eliminate all of the work that I've done previously, so hence why I use the transparent. You can also run different strengths of the transparent black, so that you can also have like a sort of mid-tone and then 3/4 strength and then get up to this stage, so that way you can better control it if you're just new to airbrushing. So you'll now notice that with this tone I'm up extremely close, and I'm being very, very cautious, taking my time and getting those edges extremely sharp where I want them to be, and controlling my shading so that it doesn't get overspray everywhere, as this is the tone that I want to sort of finish up with and shape the whole skull with. I will still be adding some highlights later on, so be sure to check out and watch until the end of this video so that you can see the skull's totally completed. But you can already see by just adding that eye socket in with this transparent black how much the skull is starting to pop and also sharpen up. You can see here using that jagged edge again to get that uneven edge on the skull. Works really well. So just lightly dusting it in and then further detailing from there. So up nice and close to work in those teeth. The airbrush that I'm currently using is the Iwata CMSB Micron. This one runs a 0.18mm needle nozzle setup. This has a side cup, so you can actually switch the cup either side depending on whether you're left or right-handed. And yes, you can also get cups with lids if you prefer that, however they are larger. Generally you don't need to put a lot of paint in the little inkwell, so I've got some of the cups with the lid and I very rarely use them. I find that if I'm going to use, or I want to use more paint, then I'll switch back to one of my gravity airbrushes with the cup on the top and the lid. You also notice that I'll add in the detail first and then I shade back over the top. Okay, so making use of another texture template here. This is out of the Texture Effects 2 series by Gerald Mendez. These are art tool templates. And again, just using that to build up a different style of texture to mix in with the micro dots. So again, using a few of the edges from the fire tool templates to create that sharp edge around the skull. So to pop it out from the background. Also adding in some cracks. And just pulling back very carefully on the airbrush and moving with it to create those fine cracks, and then shading back over them. So using the black to detail the smoke flame and make it look a bit more 3D in amongst the skull, especially where it's sort of evolving from the skull and working its way off. I'm putting those shadows underneath so that it looks like it's interacting with the actual skull artwork. Now switching back to white, and I'm going to do some final highlights on this skull. So starting off with a bit of texture, using the dots within that dispersion snap template. And you'll notice I lay it down, spray through it, lift it up, check. Lay it down, spray through it, lift it up, check. So I'm constantly keeping an eye on where I'm spraying out, so that I can control where those dots are going to land. So some bright white highlights in the teeth, up nice and close. And I'm not just covering the whole tooth, so I'm leaving some of that overspray from the black in there, and I'm just picking out some of those bright white highlights only to give it that 3D effect. If you just coat straight over the tooth, then you're going to lose that three-dimensional effect, and you want them to look a bit uneven. Apologies for the compressor kicking in, but I didn't want to cut this part out of the video. Again, further detailing with that white, just making sure to control it as well. I don't want to go over all of the shading that I've done. I want to keep it in those brighter areas. So decide where your light source is going to be and kind of follow that. But I'm also doing a bit of freehand texturing as well, so a bit of stippling, going up nice and close with the airbrush and paint on, paint off, just to create those uneven sort of textures on the skull. I don't want it to look too smooth. And also adding those highlights in the cracks to make them appear more three-dimensional. So a few more highlights on the cracks, on the cranium there. Be sure to practice if you're going to do those real fine highlights, so have a bit of scrap paper next to you or a bit of card or something that you can just practice on, because you want to make sure you get them accurate and don't spider out on those. And I'm also adding some highlights into those smoke flames, just to give them a bit more of a 3D effect. Okay, so switching back to transparent black and the dispersion snap template, I'm now detailing the next skull. So I'm going to do the same sort of procedure. I do apologise for the lighting blowing out a little bit on this skull, so I didn't want to chop this all out of the video. Hopefully you can still get plenty of value out of this, but yeah, I do apologise for the lighting on this one. So up nice and close when working on the nostril there. Keeping the airbrush moving to create those real fine sharp edges, and then shading back over them to further creating that sense of depth within the nasal cavity. Rendering the teeth. So same procedure as before, starting off with starting to outline them first, and then bringing in the shading, and the highlights will come later. Now you really notice that when I'm working up this close, the trigger finger's going back and forth, so keeping that air pressed on at all times, and I'm just pulling back ever so slightly, but I'm moving that airbrush. So kind of like using the airbrush to sketch in the detail and just build it up gradually rather than just trying to hit it all in one spot. More shading. You'll notice here that I shade back over the teeth once they're detailed. So firstly sketch them all in, get all the shape correct the way you want them to look, and then bring the shading back over the top. Again, bringing in some cracks. So pulling back slightly on the trigger and then moving to create that crack. Shading in around on the flame licks as well, just to start to give them a sense of layers as well as sharpness. And now coming in with the white, and I'm going to add highlights to this skull as well. Again, up nice and close for those real bright white highlights. And I'm only adding them into the brightest part where I want those real bright areas of the bone to shine. So don't just go putting them everywhere and flat tone back over all your hard work. Be sure to keep your texture, build on your texture, and just put those highlights in the key areas only. Okay, so moving on to the final skull now, again with that transparent black. So you'll notice this is definitely the smallest out of all three of the skulls. That said, I still want to make sure that I get lots of detail in this one. So you don't want to just say, oh, this is smaller, let's just skip on the detail. Try and put just as much detail into the smaller parts of the artwork so that they marry up with the complete project. So again, using the dispersion snap template, using some of those dots there to create more texture. And remember, if you're finding it difficult, especially with this smaller skull, to get some of that detail in freehand, by all means grab the template that you used earlier and lay that back over and just utilize that to get some of those sharp edges in, and then shade back over the top after you've done that. So once your airbrushing skill gets better, you'll be able to do most of it freehand, but as you're still learning, utilize that template more. So shading back over the top of some of that detail now, just to give the skull a bit more shape. Also bringing in those shadows on the smoke flame. And now working in the final highlights on this small skull. And again bringing those highlights in to those areas of the smoke flame. You can see how just by putting that white highlight over the top it gives that 3D look. Looks like the smoke flame is sitting over the skull, and you're looking through and you can still see some of the shading in the background, which gives it that real sense of depth. So again, spraying through the template to get some of those dot textures in there. A little bit more freehand airbrushing with that white, just to pick out the final bits and pieces to tie that skull within its surrounding smoke flame. And here we have the completed Fender with all three skulls emerging from that smoke flame. The artwork shown before clear coat, so still got to get 2-pack clear on it. Be sure to check out some of the other videos and playlists that I have listed here, that's going to help you with your airbrushing journey. And go grab your airbrush, do some amazing artwork yourself, and I'll see you again very, very soon in the next video.